Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 35 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Buffalo Sabres, in which the Sharks have managed to win 3-2. The Sharks were looking for significantly better performances than their previous two games against the Red Wings and the Pittsburgh Penguins, and you could argue that they got that here tonight. This was not anywhere near a perfect game for the Sharks, but they certainly did enough near the beginning of this game to help out when they kind of struggled near the end of this game. As we jump right into it, the first period was one of the best periods that the Sharks have played all year. Not only do they manage to score 3 goals, so that's got to put it right up there with some of the better periods that the Sharks have had, but also the Sharks' defensive game through this period was very, very good. This wasn't a completely dominated shot-wise period for the Sharks, as in terms of shot attempts, it was actually rather even between San Jose and Buffalo. The thing is, though, is that the Sharks' shots were pretty dangerous, as you can see by the fact that they scored 3 goals. Meanwhile, the Sabres shots were from pretty far out, and Adin Hill wasn't really tasked with making many big saves. In fact, the Sabres actually had a grand total of 0 high danger scoring chances in that first period. So a very solid first period that would set themselves up well for the rest of the game. But it seemed as though that the first intermission message from Bob Booner is to have the wheels not fall off as much as they did in the second period against the Detroit Red Wings. So the Sharks kind of stopped pushing and went much more so on the defensive side of things in that second period. And so there were essentially 0 offensive opportunities besides right near the start when Barabanov almost scored to make it 4-0. Besides that, the Sharks basically got nothing in terms of offensive chances, but they didn't give the Sabres much to work with either. They would get 1 goal from Jeff Skinner to make it 3-1, but otherwise that would be the score at the end of the second period. And at the beginning of the third period, things would continue like they were in that second period. The first 10 or so minutes of the third were pretty decently played defensively from the Sharks, even if they weren't generating much. But things really took a turn for the worse when Andrew Cogliano was called for a 2-minute cross-checking penalty. It seemed as though that Rasmus Dahlin, the player who drew the penalty, went down a bit easy on this cross-check, but in the end, the Sabres would be given the 2-minute power play, and they just absolutely decided to start unloading shots on net, trying to beat Adin Hill. They knew Adin Hill was, of course, a pretty fragile goaltender, has not looked particularly good pretty much the entirety of this season, but on this penalty kill, Hill looked a lot better, and the Sharks also blocked a ton of shots, and so they were able to hold the Sabres off the scoreboard for that particular power play. But once it expired, it was essentially just all Buffalo for the rest of the game, and not so much like it was in the previous 30 minutes of gameplay in which the Sabres were controlling the puck a lot, but not getting a ton of great chances. The Sabres were getting a lot of very good opportunities that were either getting blocked by the Sharks or getting saved by Adin Hill. That was until the Sharks got called with yet another penalty late in the third period, a trap that the Sharks have fallen into many times over the past few games that they have played. As Megna headed to the box, the Sabres would actually score with the goalie pulled on that power play to make it 3-2, but would be unable to get the game-tying goal. They came very close in the last 3 or 4 seconds of the game. Tage Thompson had to just go right between his legs, just barely missed his stick. And so the Sharks managed to hold on to the lead, but after a marvelous first period that they did play, they probably were hoping that this game was not going to be as close as it ended up being in that third period, as just the last half of that third was pretty disastrous and pretty akin to the periods that they played in the first against the Pittsburgh Penguins or in the second against the Detroit Red Wings. Moving on to the players here, as the first line was reunited, I guess you could say reunited. Meyer and Hertl were joined back by Barabanov after last game. Dahlin had started on that top line, and this was the best line for the San Jose Sharks by a pretty wide margin. Again, like I said, against the Red Wings, this isn't really that much of a surprise with, all of the injuries / COVID issues that the Sharks are currently dealing with. The fact is that players like Meyer and Hertl are going to shine brighter than the rest of the Sharks roster and forwards, and as such, they indeed did do so. Barabanov, I will say, also looked very, very good in this particular role on the first line. This line combined for a couple of the goals, both Hertl and Meyer getting one, and even in the second and early parts of the third, I could say, they were probably one of the only lines for the Sharks actually managing to generate any real offensive chances. Talking about the second line now would be Dahlin, Weatherby, and Gregor, and this line was semi-competitive at the very least near the start of the game. During that very successful first period that the Sharks did play, they actually had a couple of good chances. Weatherby looked very energized now on this new line with Dahlin and Gregor on his wing, so that was nice to see. I don't think this was probably one of Weatherby's better games that he's played as a San Jose Shark thus far this season, and as such in his entire career. Dahlin looked better than he has over these past few games, and Gregor looked okay as well, but most of these positives really came earlier on in this game, much more so near the first period. Come second and third period, things slowed down significantly for this line, and they found themselves defending much more so than attacking. So it was an okay performance from these three players, but not really the consistent performance that the Sharks may have been hoping for, which I guess isn't that much of a surprise, really. The main thing that you should be keeping in the back of your mind when you talk about this line of players, Weatherby, Dahlin, and Gregor, is that two of them are rookies. Dahlin and Weatherby, this is their first ever NHL season, and Gregor is certainly not a veteran in any stretch of the word. I don't even know if he has 100 games played at the NHL level at this point, so very inexperienced line, and they did okay, I would say. With the third line, it was Nieto, Bonino, and Cogliano reunited, and they managed to score the first goal of this game, which was nice to see. Matt Nieto on a very nice passing play. Bonino steals the puck along the wall, feeds to Cogliano, who makes a quick pass to Matt Nieto for the sort of tic-tac-toe, I guess you could call it, goal. Otherwise, this line was very hemmed into the Sharks' defensive zone, was defending many of the shifts that they were on the ice, and not doing a particularly great job at actually being able to clear the puck out of the zone. So it was nice to see them chip in for a goal, but for a checking line that is supposed to be the Sharks', solid defensive line that isn't supposed to be the line that's hemmed in their own zone, they found themselves defending a ton here tonight and not doing a very good job of it. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, Helbegewatz ends up getting swapped out. You know what? If he's going to be playing on the fourth line, I don't necessarily hate that he's being moved out of the lineup. I'd like to see him in the lineup and actually playing up near in the top 9 at the very least. But if he's going to be a fourth liner, it doesn't really matter if it's him or Gadjevich in my eyes. So Gadjevich steps in here. He's joined by Reedy and VL. This fourth line did absolutely nothing, as is seemingly tradition for the San Jose Sharks' fourth line. The good news, I guess you could say, is that this fourth line wasn't terrible. They weren't completely demolished on the defensive side of things, but they also didn't really do anything at all offensively, and the really only notable thing to mention about these players is that Gadjevich got into a fight. On the defensive side of things, Mario Ferraro returned from the COVID protocol and rejoined Brent Burns on the Sharks' top defensive pairing, and I was actually rather disappointed with how these two players looked here tonight. Mario Ferraro and Brent Burns made up a pairing that was kind of not so great for the San Jose Sharks. Even early on in this game, when the Sharks actually looked like the better team here tonight against the Sabres, this was the defensive pairing that kind of stuck out as to be struggling somewhat. There was even this one particular play in the first period, if not mistaken, where Mario Ferraro ends up giving the puck away near the defensive zone blue line, and then the Sabres try to rush it back around. They completely walk around Brent Burns and get a very good opportunity on net. So it just goes to show that this pairing was not really great here tonight, and you could even argue was one of the worst pairings, if not the worst pairing for the Sharks on the night. As we move on to the second pairing, was Vlasic joined by Shemek, of course, as both Middleton and Carlson got injured in the previous game. So this is now the Sharks' new second pairing. Vlasic steps back into the lineup after having been a healthy scratch against the Detroit Red Wings in the last game, and I actually thought this pairing looked quite solid. Shemek in particular, I thought, stood out in a very positive light, and Vlasic seems to have responded to that healthy scratch in a decent way. It wasn't old school Vlasic, we're never going to see that again, but it was a Vlasic performance that was good enough that it should be able to keep him in the lineup at least for the foreseeable future. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, Megna we had already been seeing in the lineup due to that healthy scratch to Marc-Edouard Vlasic, but he was joined by his usual San Jose Barracuda defensive partner Ryan Merkley, who gets another opportunity here at the NHL level. Has not played since that 6-game stretch where the Sharks were dealing with a ton of COVID issues, and it was definitely very nice and exciting to see Ryan Merkley back in the lineup here tonight, and I actually thought he had a pretty solid game. The main thing that really impressed me about Ryan Merkley here tonight was how calm he seemed when he had the puck on his stick in the defensive zone. When it comes to reading the plays and trying to actively defend, there were still some struggles in the defensive zone, absolutely, for Merkley, but I liked his calmness when he did have the puck. He was doing a very, very good job at being able to make that first pass to clear the zone. There were even a couple of times, especially early on in this game, where Merkley had the puck and I was anticipating him to make a very, very simple pass or to potentially just try and flip the puck out of the zone and maybe even end up icing it, but instead he, does a slick pass through the middle that hits a Sharks player, or he reverses it back to somebody else, where I said, wow, I didn't even see that coming, and I'm sort of looking at it a much more beneficial angle, I guess you could say, than Merkley is by being able to watch it on TV compared to Merkley actually playing the game. So that was definitely nice to see. It was good to see that he had that calmness in his game. Like I said, the defensive game is not perfect. He didn't get a ton of ice time, or really any ice time, right near the end of it, as the Sharks were just completely getting dominated in the defensive zone, and I guess they didn't want to risk sending Merkley out there just because he is the most inexperienced, or at least pretty much the most inexperienced defender on this Sharks roster, you could definitely say. But all in all, I would say it was a rather positive game for Merkley. I suspect he stays in the lineup as long as Karlsson and Middleton are both injured. I don't think Milosh would end up stepping in favor of Ryan Merkley, but of course, once Middleton and Karlsson do return from that injury, or just one of them, I suspect Merkley would be drawing out of the lineup instead of someone like Megna, who would likely stay in. And finally, let's talk about Adin Hill, a goaltender who has had his fair share of struggles thus far this season. After starting the season rather well for the Sharks, he's been just outright bad at times for San Jose, been giving up tons of bad goals in tons of different games, just not really been doing a great job at all. He came in relief of James Reimer in the previous one against the Detroit Red Wings and let in 2 goals within the first few minutes of that one, including one that wasn't particularly good. So I didn't necessarily have my hopes high for Adin Hill here tonight, but he performed actually rather well. The first period, he obviously wasn't tasked with doing much of anything at all, and the Skinner one was maybe not an amazing goal to let in, but certainly not a bad one either. It was in the third period, the last 10 minutes, where he really did shine. It would not have surprised me if the Sabres had actually managed to score that game-tying goal, and I wouldn't have even necessarily blamed Hill if that did happen, but he came up with a few very, very clutch saves, and that was definitely nice to see. One thing to mention here is that Hill was actually backed up by Zach Sawchenko here tonight. I don't exactly know what the case is with James Reimer. Apparently, it was sort of a maintenance issue, lower body injury, if I'm not mistaken, so we're not entirely sure what's going there. Maybe he just needed a mental reset because of how the last few games that he has played have gone, with those games against Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Arizona. But at the very least, the Sharks aren't in a completely awful position because Hill played a pretty decent game here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will once again face off against the Philadelphia Flyers. They just played them about a week ago and managed to win 3-2 in overtime, and so they'll be looking to close out the season series successfully, just as they did here tonight against the Buffalo Sabres. Class dismissed.